The year was 1824, and the hills of Appalachia were thick with fog and secrets. Life was hard, and people were harder. In a region where coal was blacker than the future and silence was deeper than the rivers, a boy was born under a cold moon in a crumbling cabin. His name was Ezekiel Drummond. He didn't cry when he entered the world. The midwife looked down, half expecting a stillbirth, but he was breathing, eyes wide open, unblinking, silent. His mother whispered, "He's just quiet," but her voice trembled. It wasn't the peace of silence, it was the void of it. From the beginning, Ezekiel was different. He never smiled, not once in his early years. Other children giggled when they were tossed in the air or tickled on the belly. Ezekiel simply watched, observing with unnerving calmness. He did not scream when he fell. He did not reach out to be held. If he was cold, he didn't shiver. If he was cut, he didn't cry. At age 3, he picked up a bird that had broken its wing. He stared at it for nearly an hour. When his mother asked what he was doing, he replied in a flat voice, "I wanted to see when it would stop moving." That night, she cried herself to sleep. His father didn't. His father was a preacher who believed that anything different was wicked. He thought discipline could drive out whatever spirit lingered in his boy. Belts, switches, even scripture screamed into the night. None of it changed Ezekiel. But here's what the world missed. He wasn't empty. He was processing the world differently. By the time he was 5, Ezekiel's reputation had already begun to form in the village. The Drummond boy was the one who could stare down a wild dog without flinching. He once got stung by a swarm of hornets and walked home with a face swollen, calmly saying they were just doing what they were made to do. People called him strange. Other kids avoided him. Even adults whispered about him in the general store and at the church steps. The preacher's son, they said, was soulless. But Ezekiel wasn't soulless. He was unreadable. In school, he learned faster than the others, memorizing entire passages after a single reading, solving puzzles the teacher hadn't yet explained. And yet, he never sought praise, never smiled at compliments, never cried when scolded. He was a machine in a boy's body, or so they thought. The real truth was deeper. Ezekiel wasn't a machine. He simply didn't feel the world the way others did. Where others reacted with emotion, Ezekiel calculated with logic. Where others felt guilt, he felt only consequences. Where others bonded, he measured. That's not evil, that's difference, and difference in 1824 was often mistaken for danger. The turning point in the village's view came after an accident at a lumber yard. One of the men got pinned beneath a log, his leg crushed, while the others panicked and shouted. It was 9-year-old Ezekiel who stepped forward. He didn't flinch at the blood, he didn't gag. He assessed the weight of the log, organized the lifting, and gave calm orders to men twice his size. The man's life was saved, but when asked later why he helped, Ezekiel replied, "If I hadn't done it, he would have died." That didn't seem efficient. They expected gratitude, emotion, even pride. But Ezekiel had none to offer, just action, just cold precision. That night, the village realized something haunting. Ezekiel wasn't evil, but he wasn't like them. Not in the ways that made people lovable or predictable. He was something else, a child born into shadows, navigating the world without a compass of emotion. Yet the story does not end there, because from that darkness came a different kind of light. Not all who are born into shadows become monsters. Some become mirrors, some become tools. Some become disciplined minds shaped by structure instead of sympathy. And in Ezekiel's case, his difference wouldn't just haunt his village. It would save it. He was not a villain, not a victim, not even a hero. He was a reminder that even if you're born into silence, even if the world doesn't understand how you think, you still have the power to choose who you become. They said Ezekiel Drummond had eyes that never blinked, not in fear, not in surprise, not even in sleep. His mother once claimed she woke up in the middle of the night and found him sitting in a chair by the fireplace, staring into the flames, unmoving. His eyes, she said, were dry, not irritated, not red, just open, watching. It wasn't that he refused to blink. It was that he didn't need to or didn't see the point. Most children blink when startled. They flinch, they laugh, they cry. Ezekiel didn't. His classmates tested it constantly. They'd clap loudly behind his ear, slam books on desks, pretend to fall down. One boy even threw a rock near him, just to see his reaction. Nothing. Ezekiel would simply look at you long, deep, unblinking, as if he were scanning your soul with cold precision. Some found it terrifying, others found it fascinating, but none of them could deny it. There was something in his eyes that didn't belong in a child. Ezekiel didn't speak much, but he listened to everything. He noticed what others missed. He saw the truth behind the noise, the patterns behind the chaos. It made him the best in his class at arithmetic, logic, and geometry. But he failed miserably at storytelling, poetry, and music. Not because he couldn't grasp them, but because they required imagination. Ezekiel didn't imagine. He calculated. At the age of 12, something happened that would shape his entire life. A fire broke out at the town's granary, an old structure built of dry wood and filled with sacks of grain. It was a windy night, and the fire spread quickly. People screamed and ran for water. Panic swept through the village like wildfire itself. Buckets were dropped, horses kicked loose. No one could think straight, except Ezekiel. He stood at the edge of the smoke with those same unblinking eyes, watching the angles of the flames, the way the wind shifted, the structure's tension points. And then, like a man possessed by mathematical certainty, he grabbed a wooden board and broke open a side wall, allowing the grain to spill out into the field before it could ignite. He didn't blink, even as the heat scorched his skin. By the time the townsmen realized what he was doing, the worst of the fire was already dying. The granary was safe. Mostly, a few beams were scorched, but the grain was preserved. Crops didn't fail that winter. Families survived because of a boy who saw clearly while everyone else was blinded by fear. And still, people weren't sure what to make of him. "Why didn't you run?" one man asked Ezekiel that night, shaking with soot still on his hands. Ezekiel replied, "Running doesn't change the outcome, calculating does." This is where the lesson lies. Ezekiel Drummond didn't feel like others, but he saw more clearly than most. Where others were overwhelmed by emotion, he remained steady. He never blinked, because blinking meant missing a moment, and Ezekiel couldn't afford to miss anything. His eyes, always open, were his armor and his weapon. But this isn't a story about being fearless. No one is truly fearless, not even Ezekiel. This is a story about being grounded, about resisting the urge to react when the world demands your panic, about staying centered when everything around you screams for chaos. Because sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who fight loudly, they're the ones who watch silently and act wisely. In a world where most people live reaction to reaction, Ezekiel teaches something powerful. Stillness is not weakness. Unblinking does not mean unfeeling. The greatest strength can lie in observation, in preparation, in restraint. Ezekiel Drummond, with his emotionless stare and unnerving stillness, was not without purpose. He was a mirror to the world, showing people that just because someone doesn't respond the way you expect doesn't mean they don't care. It simply means they process differently, and in that difference lies brilliance. For years, Ezekiel Drummond had been labeled everything society didn't understand. Cold, distant, strange, even inhuman. His lack of empathy baffled doctors. His lack of expression unsettled neighbors. He was the boy who never cried, never laughed, and never blinked. But something was always simmering beneath the surface, something no one could fully see, something even Ezekiel himself hadn't discovered yet. That something revealed itself in the spring of 1842, when he was 18. It was a season of drought. The earth cracked under the sun's fury. The crops withered in the fields, and animals lay panting in the shade. The Drummond farm, like many others, faced collapse. Wells dried up. Hopes ran thinner than the river, and then came the fever. A sickness swept through the valley like smoke through a chimney, fast, silent, and deadly. Children were the first to fall, mothers next. Within 2 weeks, 6 families were mourning. The town doctor called it brain fever, but no remedy he applied worked. Quinine failed, herbal tinctures failed. The prayers of the town pastor, though earnest, changed nothing, and then Ezekiel's mother fell ill. For the first time in his life, the boy who had always been calm froze. He stood at her bedside with those same wide eyes, watching her convulse in sweat and tremors. Her breath was shallow, her lips were cracked, but more than that, her warmth was fading. The woman who had raised him, protected him, fed him, and taught him how to survive in silence, was now at the edge of something Ezekiel could not calculate. Death, and for the first time, Ezekiel felt helpless, not because he lacked knowledge, but because for all his knowledge, he couldn't stop the inevitable, and that's when it happened. He blinked. It was just once. Just a moment, but in that single blink, it was as if the floodgates opened. Emotion rushed in. Ezekiel stumbled back from the bed, choking, not from illness, but from something deeper, grief. He realized he had never truly considered the possibility of losing her. All his life, he had analyzed the world around him with pure logic. But in that quiet farmhouse, with his mother between life and death, Ezekiel encountered something his logic could not handle: love. And from that moment, everything changed. He didn't run to the doctor. He didn't beg the pastor. Instead, Ezekiel disappeared into the woods. For 3 straight days, no one saw him. Some thought he'd finally lost his grip on reality. Others assumed he was mourning in his own strange way, but Ezekiel was doing what he had always done: studying, searching, solving. He tracked animal behavior, studying which herbs they avoided and which they chewed when sick. He gathered mosses, bark, roots. He boiled, ground, and tasted. He tested on rabbits and pigeons. Then finally, when he was certain, he returned. Ezekiel made a tonic thick, greenish, bitter. He spooned it slowly into his mother's mouth, even when she was barely conscious. 3 doses every 6 hours. She protested in her fevered haze, but he persisted, and on the 4th day her fever broke. She opened her eyes, weak, blurry, but alive. She looked at Ezekiel, and for the first time in her life, she saw tears in his eyes. That moment became Ezekiel's turning point, not because he finally felt what others felt, but because he accepted that emotion has value even when it doesn't make sense, that love, grief, and compassion are not weaknesses to overcome, but strengths to carry, that science doesn't always explain the human soul, and maybe it shouldn't try to. Ezekiel went on to help treat others in the town. He made more of the tonic. Some he saved, some he didn't, but every death taught him something new, not just about medicine, but about what it means to care. For the first time in his life, people didn't fear Ezekiel. They admired him, they thanked him, some even followed him, not because they understood him, but because they saw the spark of something human in him now. Not logic, not brilliance, compassion. The boy who never blinked, finally blinked, and from that blink came a flood of purpose, action, and legacy. Because sometimes your greatest strength isn't the part of you the world praises. Sometimes it's the part you've hidden, even from yourself, and when that part awakens, you stop existing as a mystery and start living as a miracle. By the winter of 1844, Ezekiel Drummond was no longer the misunderstood farm boy that townsfolk whispered about. He had become something else, something they could not define but instinctively respected. And yet, under all his strange brilliance and quiet intensity, one dangerous truth still pulsed like a ticking clock within him: rage. It was not the rage of loud men who broke chairs and screamed in taverns. It was not the rage of soldiers who charged into battle. No, Ezekiel's anger was deeper, colder, more precise. It was born from years of alienation, misunderstanding, humiliation, and rejection. It was the kind of rage that sat still, never shaking, but always waiting. He remembered every time someone had called him a freak, every time a doctor poked at his mind like it was diseased, every time a preacher told his mother that the boy needs God to fix his soul. He remembered it all. Every cruel smirk, every slammed door, and now that he was respected, now that he had power, rage knocked on the door of his heart, asking to be released. The opportunity came swiftly. In the spring of 1845, a fire broke out in the town's mill, the only place that gave work to over 60 families. The fire was not an accident. It was arson, and the town sheriff, without evidence, accused Ezekiel, not because he was guilty, but because he was different, because difference still scared people. The sheriff stood in the middle of town, voice booming. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't smile. He never looks you in the eye. That boy's got the devil's calm. And in front of a gathering crowd, they arrested him. Ezekiel didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't even blink. He sat in the town jail, watching the fire's smoke still curling over the hill, and let his mind run. He could escape if he wanted. He knew how to pick a lock. He had read every book on physics, metallurgy, and human anatomy. He could escape, disappear, even make them all regret ever pointing a finger at him. The rage inside him whispered, "Burn it all down," but instead, he chose something else. While locked away, Ezekiel requested books, legal codes, moral philosophy, and logic theory. He read by candlelight, page after page, not to escape, but to understand. How does a man respond to injustice without becoming what he hates? In those quiet hours, he made a vow. "I will build rules to govern the fire within me, because if I do not, I will become what they think I am." He drew up a code of personal laws, not written for others, but for himself. A system, a structure, boundaries. It included things like never react in emotion until 48 hours have passed, never act without evidence, never defend yourself by destroying others. These were his laws. His way of containing the storm when the real arsonist was found, a drunken worker trying to get revenge on the mill owner. The sheriff had no choice but to release Ezekiel, but he didn't leave in silence. Ezekiel walked back into town square, stood atop the courthouse steps, and did something he had never done before. He spoke, publicly, boldly, to the same people who had judged him. "You think the absence of emotion is wickedness, but I say the absence of reason is what burns towns down. You wanted me to burn with you, but I built walls instead, not to shut you out, to protect what I'm still trying to understand inside myself." The crowd was silent. And in that moment they saw not a freak, but a man who could have chosen revenge, but instead chose restraint, a man who proved that true strength isn't power itself, governance. Ezekiel's personal code became something of legend. Young boys would whisper about the rules of Drummond, and teachers began using his story to explain moral reasoning. What Ezekiel taught without ever intending to teach was this: rage is easy, revenge is cheap. But building a structure within yourself to rise above the flame, that's rare, that's noble, that's powerful, and perhaps that's why Ezekiel Drummond, who never smiled, never flinched, and never blinked, left a mark on the world not through emotion, but through discipline, because when rage begged him to destroy, he wrote rules to rebuild. By the time Ezekiel Drummond was in his 40s, he had witnessed more human cruelty, more rejection, and more misunderstanding than most endure in a lifetime. And through it all, not once, had anyone ever seen him cry. Some whispered it was because he couldn't, others said it was because he didn't care, but the truth was far more complicated and far more powerful. Ezekiel didn't cry because the pain he carried had no outlet. No one had ever taught him how. From childhood, every display of emotion had been met with suspicion, mockery, or fear, so he buried it deeply. Layer after layer, the sorrow turned to silence, the grief became grit. Where tears would have fallen, resolve took their place. He had become a man of tools and systems, not emotions and sentiment. He built machines that harvested crops faster than horses could. He repaired broken bridges using clever truss designs learned from old engineering books. He created order wherever he went. But when he walked through his own home, there were no framed portraits, no soft melodies, no laughter echoing off the walls. Only the quiet ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of aging wood. He lived alone, not because he wanted to, but because connection still felt like a language he never learned to speak. Still, he never quit. In 1856, a young boy from town, named Caleb, was orphaned when a riverboat capsized during a storm. The boy had no relatives. No one came to claim him. The town was preparing to send him off to a faraway orphanage when Ezekiel, unprompted, arrived at the town hall and said 5 simple words: "He can stay with me." The room fell silent. People stared in disbelief. Ezekiel Drummond, the man who never smiled, wanted to raise a child, but the sheriff, who had once arrested Ezekiel out of fear but had long since come to respect him, simply nodded and said, "If he's with you, he's safe." Caleb moved into the old Drummond farmhouse that very night. At first the boy was terrified. Ezekiel was tall, silent, and seemed to float like a shadow through the house. He never yelled, never scolded, but also never hugged, never comforted, and yet, over time, something extraordinary happened. Every morning, Ezekiel would set out Caleb's boots, polished. Every evening, the tools Caleb had used were cleaned and organized without a word. When Caleb had nightmares, Ezekiel sat silently at the end of his bed, unmoving, until the boy drifted off again. He didn't know how to speak comfort, so he showed it through presence. He didn't say, "I'm proud of you." But he taught Caleb to carve, to fix, to build, and sat for hours beside him, pointing out how to steady his hands and sharpen his focus. And slowly, Caleb learned something the world had forgotten about Ezekiel. He might not cry, he might not laugh, but he never quit on the people he chose to protect. When Caleb grew older, he asked him once, "Didn't you ever feel like giving up, Mr. Drummond? Didn't you ever want to just disappear?" Ezekiel stared out the window for a long time before answering. "Every day. But the difference between feeling it and following it is what keeps a man upright. I never had the luxury to fall apart, so I learned how to stand still." By the time Ezekiel passed away in the winter of 1881, he had no wife, no family name passed down, no journals or confessions. But the stories people told about him, they filled rooms. And Caleb, now a respected architect, stood at his graveside and said, "He never shed a tear, but he taught me how to carry pain without letting it rot my heart. He was a father, a protector, and the strongest man I ever knew, not because of how loud he loved, but because of how steadily he stayed." Ezekiel Drummond remains to this day an enigma, a man science couldn't explain, a man society never fully understood, but above all, a man who never gave in to the darkness inside him, not because he lacked it, but because he refused to let it win. He couldn't cry, but he never quit, and in the end that made him more human than most. Long after Ezekiel Drummond's death in 1881, the townsfolk of Fairhollow still whispered his name, but not the way they once had. During his life, Ezekiel was misunderstood, feared, even labeled as something inhuman. He was the man who never cried, the shadow of the valley, the silent storm. A mind like his, detached from emotional expression and governed by unbreakable routine, had baffled physicians, clergy, and neighbors alike. But in the years after his passing, a shift occurred. As time softened the fears and myths, something more profound came into focus. Ezekiel Drummond hadn't just lived. He had built something, a legacy, not of wealth or status, but of discipline, grit, and unshakable character. In the decades that followed, it was discovered that Ezekiel had kept meticulous journals, not about his feelings, but about his systems. They were logs of observation, self-control strategies, mechanical designs, moral reflections, even daily charts that documented how he kept his impulses in check. Though he had no formal education, his journals revealed the mind of a man who taught himself to master his environment and himself. One entry read, "Impulse breeds ruin. Thought creates order. When rage comes, I build. When fear comes, I study. When pain comes, I work." Psychologists from Boston, New York, and even London would later call his writings early behavioral self-regulation models, decades before such concepts were recognized in science. But for Ezekiel, it wasn't theory. It was survival. Caleb, the orphan he raised, ensured that Ezekiel's journals weren't lost to time. He compiled them, annotated them, and eventually published a book titled The Disciplined Mind, Lessons from Ezekiel Drummond. It wasn't an instant success. But quietly, slowly, it began to circulate among young men who struggled with anger, among war veterans who came home with minds they didn't recognize, among farmers, carpenters, even preachers who admired Ezekiel's resilience. One passage resonated across generations: "A man without emotion is not dead. He may be silent, but inside him the battle still rages. Victory does not come from feeling less. It comes from doing right, regardless of how you feel." Years later, during the industrial boom of the early 1900s, several inventors credited Ezekiel's mechanical notebooks for inspiring their early designs in irrigation and pulley systems. His calculations, written in neat rows by candlelight on yellowed paper, were studied in technical colleges. But beyond the innovations, it was his way of life that became the true inheritance. Ezekiel never preached, but he lived as though every action was a lesson and every silence a space for reflection. His legacy taught something society still struggles to understand today, that emotional expression and emotional discipline are not opposites, that even a man labeled psychopath by his time may in truth be a master of restraint, not a slave to chaos. That the mind, no matter how misaligned from the norm, can be trained to serve, not destroy. 100 years after his death, in a small stone park in Fairhollow, a bronze plaque was placed beneath the large oak tree near what was once Ezekiel's home. It doesn't bear his face or a long eulogy. It reads, "Here lived a man who mastered himself, and by doing so, helped others find peace in their own storms." And perhaps that is the ultimate mark of a legacy worth remembering. Not the stories people tell, but the structure they build from the lessons you left behind. Ezekiel Drummond, misunderstood in life, became a model of transformation in death. Not because he was perfect, not because he was warm, but because he never gave up on self-mastery, no matter how strange the world found him. In a world that chases validation, Ezekiel chased virtue. And that legacy, it can't be measured in emotion, it can't be explained by science, but it can be lived by anyone willing to be disciplined enough to carry it forward. Some people are born with fire, others with frost. Ezekiel Drummond was born cold, but he didn't stay cruel. He chose structure over chaos, duty over feeling, and order over impulse, and that choice made all the difference. So if you feel different, broken, unemotional, remember this: you don't have to be soft to be good, you don't have to feel love to choose it, and you don't have to be explained to be impactful.